The rejection email arrived the same morning. Sarah Mitchell saw the job listing for the Blackwood Hotel's winter caretaker position. While your previous work showed promise, her publisher wrote, your latest manuscript lacks the psychological depth we've come to expect. Sarah stared at her laptop screen, the cursor blinking mockingly at the end of Chapter 12, the same spot it had been blinking for 3 months. The divorce had taken more than her marriage. It had stolen her words. Richard had always been her first reader, her sounding board. Now her characters felt as hollow as the empty side of her bed. The advance for her next book had long since run out, and her agent's calls were becoming less frequent. The Blackwood Hotel's listing seemed almost too perfect. 6 months of solitude in the Colorado Rockies, room and board included, plus a modest salary. Winter caretaker needed, it read. Writing/creative background preferred. Sarah's fingers trembled as she dialed the number. 3 days later, her ancient Honda struggled up the winding mountain road toward what could be either her salvation or her complete undoing. The Blackwood emerged from the pine forest like a Victorian fever dream. 4 stories of red brick and white trim, with towers and turrets reaching toward a steel-gray sky heavy with impending snow. Mr. Harrison, the owner, waited on the wide front porch. At 72, he carried himself with the precise dignity of someone who had spent decades managing luxury establishments. But there was something else in his bearing, a wariness that seemed at odds with his professional demeanor. Mrs. Mitchell, he called out as she emerged from her car. Just Ms. now, Sarah corrected, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. But please call me Sarah. Harrison nodded, his eyes flickering briefly to her bare ring finger. Of course. We should begin the tour before the storm hits. There's quite a bit to cover. The entrance hall took Sarah's breath away. Soaring ceilings crowned with crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs scattered across marble floors like fallen leaves, dark wood paneling that seemed to swallow the weak afternoon light. Their footsteps echoed strangely, creating a syncopated rhythm that made it sound as though a third person walked just behind them. The Blackwood has stood here since 1891, Harrison said as they walked. It survived fires, bankruptcies, and more Colorado winters than anyone can count. But it's the isolation that poses the greatest challenge. The road becomes impassable from November to April, hence our need for a winter caretaker. What happened to the previous caretaker? Sarah asked, noting how Harrison's shoulders stiffened slightly. Mr. Jenkins had to leave abruptly. Personal reasons. He quickened his pace. The maintenance requirements are straightforward. Checking the boilers, preventing pipe freezes, basic upkeep. The real challenge is the solitude. 6 months is a long time to be alone with one's thoughts. Sarah thought of her empty apartment in Denver, the unfinished manuscript that mocked her daily, the concerned calls from her sister that she'd stopped answering. Solitude is exactly what I need. Harrison's expression was impossible to read. Yes, that's what they all say at first. They spent the next 2 hours touring the hotel systems. The temperamental boiler that needed daily coaxing, the backup generators that sometimes sparked and whined, the ancient fuse boxes with their handwritten labels faded nearly to illegibility. Sarah took careful notes, but her writer's mind kept wandering, imagining the stories these walls must hold. How many guests had passed through these corridors over the decades? How many secrets had been whispered in these rooms? The hotel has an interesting history with writers, Harrison mentioned casually as they passed the library. Something about the isolation seems to inspire them. Or perhaps it's the hotel itself. Places can have their own kind of gravity, don't you think? They draw certain types of people to them. Sarah paused in the library doorway. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, their contents a mix of leather-bound classics and forgotten bestsellers. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred and stained with what looked like ink. Was that here during the hotel's heyday? She asked, running her fingers along the desk's edge. Harrison's lips tightened. That desk has been here since 1963. A guest left it, a writer who stayed here to finish his masterpiece. He did finish it, technically speaking. The manuscript was found in the desk drawer after. He trailed off. Well, the past is the past. Shall we continue? They moved through the hotel's upper floors, Harrison pointing out various quirks and concerns. The fourth floor was closed off entirely. Heat efficiency, he explained. The east wing of the third floor was also restricted, allegedly due to ongoing renovations. But it was when they reached room 217 that Harrison's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "This room is strictly off-limits," he said, his voice sharp. "The floor is unstable, waiting for repairs in the spring. The whole wing should be avoided if possible." Sarah studied the door. Solid oak like all the others, but something about it seemed different. The brass numbers looked newer than those on surrounding rooms, and the wood around the lock was scarred as if someone had tried to force it open. Before she could ask any questions, Harrison's phone buzzed. "The storm's moving in faster than expected," he said, checking the message. "I should leave while the roads are still passable." He handed her a leather briefcase. "All the contact numbers are in here, including mine. Though I should warn you, cell service can be unreliable during storms." Sarah watched from the front steps as Harrison's car disappeared into the thickening snow. The wind had picked up, making the old building creak and sigh around her. She was alone, more alone than she'd been since before her marriage 13 years ago. That first night, she made a simple dinner in the industrial kitchen and set up her laptop in the library. The room felt right somehow, as if it had been waiting for her. She opened her manuscript, a psychological thriller about a woman who begins to doubt her own memories, and began to type. The words came easier here. The story flowed from her fingers as it hadn't in months, her characters suddenly alive and breathing. By midnight, she had added 3,000 words and restructured the problematic chapter 12. Satisfied, she saved her work and headed to the caretaker's apartment on the ground floor. The dream came without warning. She was walking down one of the hotel's endless corridors, following the sound of typing. The carpet muffled her footsteps, but each door she passed seemed to vibrate slightly, as though something behind them was straining to get out. The typing grew louder, a frenzied clicking that reminded her of insects or falling rain or fingernails on wood. When she reached room 217, the door was ajar, spilling yellow lamplight into the hall. Sarah woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs. The digital clock on her nightstand read 3:33 a.m. The wind had intensified, making the old building groan and settle. But underneath those familiar sounds, she could have sworn she heard typing. Grabbing her flashlight, Sarah stepped into the hallway. The emergency lights cast a sickly glow, creating more shadows than illumination. The typing sound had stopped, if it had ever been there at all. Still, she found herself walking toward the grand staircase, drawn by some inexplicable urge to check. The library was exactly as she had left it, her laptop closed and dark on the desk. Sarah let out a shaky breath. Of course it was just a dream, just her writer's imagination working overtime in a new environment. She was alone in the hotel, alone for miles, with the storm now raging outside. That's when she saw it. An ancient typewriter sitting on the desk beside her laptop. She was certain it hadn't been there when she left. A single sheet of paper was threaded through the roller, the type faded but still legible. "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." The phrase was repeated down the entire page, the letters becoming increasingly uneven toward the bottom, as if typed by increasingly unsteady hands. Sarah backed away from the desk, her fingers tingling with pins and needles. This had to be some kind of joke. Perhaps Harrison was testing her, seeing if she'd scare easily. She checked her phone. No service, just as he'd warned. Outside, the snow was falling so heavily she could barely see the parking lot. Sleep was impossible now. She made her way to the kitchen, thinking a cup of tea might calm her nerves. The industrial space felt different at night, the stainless steel surfaces reflecting the emergency lights in ways that created strange, shifting patterns. As she waited for the kettle to boil, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold, the distinct sound of an elevator moving. The hotel's only elevator had been shut down for the winter. Harrison had been very clear about that. The kettle began to whistle, making her jump. Sarah quickly turned it off, straining to hear over her pounding heart. The elevator sounds had stopped, but now she could hear footsteps above her. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to be following the path she had taken with Harrison during the tour. "Hello?" she called out, immediately regretting it. If someone had somehow broken in, Announcing her presence wasn't wise. The footsteps stopped. Then, impossibly, they began moving faster, heading straight for the stairs that led to the kitchen. Sarah ran. She sprinted through the dark corridors, barely aware of where she was going until she found herself in the lobby. The front doors were locked. She had checked them herself before going to bed. The snow outside was now a solid white wall, the wind screaming like a living thing. The footsteps were getting closer. In desperation, Sarah ran up the grand staircase. She needed to hide, to think, to figure out what was happening. The second floor was darker than the first, the emergency lights spaced further apart. She turned left, then right, no longer sure which part of the hotel she was in, until she saw the number on the door in front of her, 217. The door was ajar, just like in her dream. A faint light spilled out from the crack, along with the sound of typing. Sarah knew she shouldn't look. Every horror movie she'd ever seen, every story she'd ever written told her to run in the opposite direction. But she was a writer, and writers needed to know the ending of the story. She pushed the door open. The room was exactly as Harrison had described it. Floor torn up, furniture covered in sheets. But there, in the center of the room, sat an old desk with a typewriter identical to the one she'd seen in the library. The keys were moving on their own, punching out words on a sheet of paper. Sarah stepped closer, unable to stop herself. The typing slowed, then stopped. The paper rolled up slightly, revealing what had been written. "Welcome to the Blackwood, Sarah. We've been waiting for another writer." The temperature in the room plummeted. Sarah could see her breath forming clouds in the air. Behind her, the door slammed shut with enough force to shake the walls. She wasn't alone anymore. Something moved beneath one of the sheet-covered shapes, a figure taking form, the fabric draping over invisible shoulders like a shroud. Sarah backed away until she hit the desk, her hand brushing against the typewriter's keys. The figure turned toward her, the sheet falling away to reveal nothing. Empty air where a face should have been. But then it spoke, in a voice that sounded like paper tearing. "Do you want to know what happened to the others? The ones who came before?" Images flashed through Sarah's mind. A man at the library desk, typing frantically as shadows gathered around him. A woman in room 217, screaming as the walls began to bleed ink. Countless writers over the decades, all drawn to the Blackwood's dark gravity, all feeding their stories into its hungry depths. "The hotel needs stories," the voice continued. "It feeds on them, on the creativity, the passion, the desperation of writers like you, like us." Sarah's fingers found the typewriter keys again, and suddenly she understood. The Blackwood hadn't just been waiting for another writer. It had been waiting for her specifically. All her life, she'd struggled to find her voice, to tell the stories that burned inside her. Even her divorce had been about that in the end. Richard couldn't understand why her characters sometimes felt more real to her than he did. The sheet-draped figure moved closer. "You can join us, Sarah. Your words will live forever in these walls. Your stories will never end." Sarah looked at the typewriter, then at her laptop still sitting in the library below. She thought about her unfinished manuscript, about all the stories she still wanted to tell. "No," she whispered. "My stories are mine." She grabbed the typewriter and hurled it through the window. Glass shattered, letting in a blast of snow and wind. The figure lunged for her, but Sarah was already running. Down the corridors, down the stairs, through the lobby to her car. The engine started on the first try, as if it too wanted to escape. Sarah gunned it down the driveway, the chains on her tires barely gripping the snow-covered road. In her rearview mirror, she saw lights moving through the Blackwood's windows and thought she could hear typing. Dozens of typewriters all clicking at once, their sounds carrying over the storm. She drove until she reached the nearest town, until she found a motel with vacancy and cell service. With shaking fingers, she called Harrison. "I'm not surprised," he said when she told him what had happened. "The hotel? It has a way of choosing its caretakers, the ones it wants to keep." "What happened to the others?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "They're still there, in a way. Their stories are in the walls, in the air itself. The Blackwood never lets go of a good story." Sarah hung up and opened her laptop. The manuscript was still there, but something had changed. The words felt different now, stronger, darker, more urgent. She began to type, and the story poured out of her. A tale of a hotel that fed on creativity, that drew writers to it like moths to a flame. She wrote through the night, through the next day, through the following week. When she finally emerged, she had not just a novel but a trilogy planned. Her agent called it her best work yet, raw and haunting. The kind of story that would stay with readers long after they closed the book. The Blackwood Hotel still stands against the Colorado sky, waiting for the next caretaker, the next writer seeking solitude. Sometimes, guests at nearby hotels report seeing lights moving in the supposedly closed building. Some even claim they can hear typing late at night, though the hotel is clearly empty. But Sarah never returned to check. She didn't need to. She had taken something from the Blackwood, inspiration, perhaps, or something darker, but she hadn't given it what it really wanted, herself. Her stories were her own, and she would tell them her way. Still, on cold nights when the wind howls like typing keys, she thinks about room 217, about the stories trapped within those walls. And sometimes, when she's writing late at night, she swears she can hear other typewriters clicking in the distance, their ghostly keys spelling out the same message over and over. All work and no play makes you us all dull boys and girl. The Blackwood is patient. It can wait. After all, there will always be another writer seeking solitude, another soul drawn to its dark gravity. And next time, it might not let them go. And still today, if you drive past the Blackwood Hotel on a cold winter night, you might see lights moving through its empty corridors, or hear the distant sound of typewriters clicking in the darkness. Sometimes, travelers swear they can see a woman typing at the library window, though the hotel has been closed for years. But Sarah never returned to check. She writes her stories from the safety of her Denver apartment now, though sometimes, late at night when the wind howls like typing keys, she thinks about room 217 and the stories trapped within those walls. The Blackwood still stands against the Colorado sky, waiting for the next writer seeking solitude, the next soul drawn to its dark gravity. And next time, it might not let them go. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more horror tales. Hit that notification bell to make sure you don't miss our next upload. A particularly dark story that I've been saving for a special occasion. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever felt a strange presence while staying at a hotel? Or perhaps you've heard mysterious typing sounds in abandoned buildings. Join our growing horror community and remember, not all empty rooms are truly empty. Until next story, pleasant dreams.